these meetings that we realized that a teach-in series on prison organizing would be incredibly meaningful and useful to activists, where we could reflect and think and learn together. So the idea to have a series like this was born. Tracy Matthews, Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and my co-conspirator in launching the Mass Incarceration Working Group here at the University of Chicago, and also my colleague Ruben Miller, thought that this would be the perfect project for the Mass Incarceration Working Group. So we enlisted David Knight to curate this series. David is a PhD candidate in the political science department here. He's also part of the interdisciplinary training program in the education series. And at the Posen Center Human Rights Lab, David supports the lab's mixed enrollment courses and is currently TAing a course that I'm teaching, Incarceration and Justice. And he's really organized a dynamic series for us. We had Heather Ann Thompson and Brittany Friedman join us earlier this year. Then we had Dan Berger and Clifton Sky Williamson. And now we're so excited to welcome Toussaint Lozier and Nancy Kershaw, who will also be joined later on in the conversation by Kilroy Watkins and Meli Rios to share their wisdom with us. So before I hand it over to David, who will be moderating this conversation and introducing our speakers, I want to thank the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Mass Incarceration Working Group, and also our team who helped make this event happen: Marilyn Richardson, Tierra Kilpatrick, Michael Fisher, and Madeline Wright. So with that, take it away, David.
Thank you so much, Alice. We are so honored to have with us here today Nancy Kershaw and Toussaint Lozier. Nancy is an American activist who participated in the civil rights and peace movements as far back as high school. In college, she was a member of the Friends of SNCC and CORE and participated in the first demonstration against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. in April 1965. She has participated in for many years in campaigns to free political prisoners, such as the Puerto Rican political prisoners, Sundiata Acoli, Geronimo Pratt, and many others. She was active in the fight against control unit prisons as a founding member of the Committee to End the Marian Lockdown, described in her book Out of Control, a 15-year battle against control unit prisons. She has also written widely distributed article on women in imprisonment in the United States. And so on the Eventbrite, you can read her and Toussaint's work on many different pieces. Toussaint Lozier is an assistant professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Lozier holds a PhD in history from the University of Chicago, with his research focusing on grassroots responses to the post-war emergence of mass incarceration in Chicago. At UMass Amherst, he teaches courses on African-American history, Black politics, criminal justice policy, and transnational social movements. His writing has been published in Souls, Radical History Review, the Journal of Urban History, Against the Current, and Left Turn magazine. He's the co-author of Rethinking the American Prison Movement with Dan Berger, and is preparing a book manuscript entitled War for the City, Black Liberation and the Consolidation of the Carceral State. And I have both their books actually right here. Had them already before, well before this, and brilliant, beautiful books. Please do read them. As we all continue to think more deeply about repression and our ongoing movements against it. So just so we can start, I want to start off by asking you briefly to describe, the histories that you've written about on prison lockdowns and prison organizing in Illinois, just so we can all sort of have basic understanding. Toussaint, you've written much about the Pontiac Prison Rebellion, and Nancy, of course, you've had organized for many years in the fight against controlled unit prisons in Illinois. And so I thought it would be great if for you to share these histories. And I don't know, Toussaint, if you would be open to beginning, and then followed by Nancy.
Actually, if Nancy could go first.
Sure.
We did rock, paper, scissors at the outset, and she. So.
Excellent.
First of all, I'd just like to thank all the people who made this possible, particularly David Knight, who's been the main person I've been in correspondence with, and the Mass Incarceration Working Group. I like just saying those words because when I was organizing around Marian, there was no such thing as a Mass Incarceration Working Group at UFC or anywhere else for that matter. So it's really exciting to see that it exists. And so happy to be here with Toussaint, who I met years ago when he came through boxes to see boxes in my basement that belonged to my late husband, Steve Whitman, who was part of the defense of the Pontiac brothers. And Toussaint was just sort of a kid at that point. And now I have followed him from afar, and it's exciting to see all the work he's doing. I don't have a great deal of time to talk today, so I want to just encourage people, if they want to know more, to go to the Freedom Archives website, where you can either order my book or you can read a free abridged version of it, which actually links to a lot of great documents and video clips as well. So I feel very humble talking about the work we did. Times are so very different now, and so many people are engaged in work. You know, I open my email box and there's emails about prison work from California to Alabama and all points in between. And that's so exciting. But I will offer a few observations, because I believe that the past is not a destination, but it is a resource, a quote I recently learned. A word just about Marian, in case, oh, my daughter is even here, in case there are some people here who do not know about Marian. In the early 1960s, the notorious Alcatraz prison in California was closed. And at the same time, approximately, the Marian Federal Penitentiary was opened in downstate Illinois. It was the only level 6 prison in the federal prison system. It was considered the end of the line and where the feds sent all the, quote, bad apples. By the time we started our work, all 350 men were held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, 7 days a week for years, sometimes months, but sometimes years and years on end. And I have about 3 observations to make about our work, and hopefully they'll have some resonance. The first is that prison work is best when it's driven by the energy, the guidance, and the lived experience of incarcerated people. As a mostly white committee, we thought it was critical not to compete with the self-organization of people of color. And everything we did was in close consultation with Black and Puerto Rican organizations, many of whose members were either had been incarcerated or were incarcerated at the time that we began our work. So the voice of prisoners was embedded in our work from the jump, and in that we were very lucky. The few of us who began the work were mostly anti-racist activists from the 60s. And as such, my friends and I were first drawn to Marian because of the disproportionate number of political prisoners that were there. Leonard Peltier was there at the time, Sundiata Acoli and Sekou Odinga, Bill Dunn. And a few months after we began our work, Oscar Lopez Rivera was transferred in. And over the years, other political prisoners were also transferred in. And I wish I had time to tell you about each and every one of them. We produced, the Committee on the Marian Lockdown folks produced about 6 editions of Can't Jail the Spirit over the years, which were collections of biographies, photos, and contacts for political prisoners across the country. But our connection went way beyond the explicitly political prisoners. We corresponded with thousands of other folks throughout the prison system in the United States, and most of us regularly visited prisoners, although not at Marian. We produced a pamphlet each year called Reflections on the Lockdown, a collection of pieces from any Marian prisoner who cared to contribute. And we always uplifted the voices of incarcerated people in our publications, our educational events, and rallies. The prison bureaucrats will tell you not to trust what prisoners say, but do trust what incarcerated folks tell you about prison conditions, support their efforts to change their situations, and help their voices reach the outside world. The second point I'd like to make is that it's important to challenge the underlying ideology that leads to mass incarceration in order for us to make real change. We were constantly linking individual stories with larger systemic structural concerns. We insisted that racism was central to an understanding of imprisonment, of course. But even that assertion, which seems so obvious now, was very controversial then. And we went beyond that. We also challenged the link between crime and incarceration. Again, my husband, Steve, was a statistician, actually an epidemiologist is his day job, and I guess we all know what that is now. He provided data that showed that crime rates and incarceration rates were unrelated. And we all believe that the explosion of incarceration in the 80s and 90s was a response by the government to the insurgency of the 60s and early 70s, both outside and within the prisons, including the California prison movement, the rebellion at Attica, and the resistance at Marian. So mass incarceration can be viewed, if you will, as counterinsurgency. American prisons are intended to be a key weapon in ensuring that people of color stay in their place. At one point, we produced a newsletter called Abolish, but it was referring to the abolition of control units. Some of us were prison abolitionists, and many of us were in favor of abolishing capitalism altogether, but we never imagined being effective in raising that as a central tenet of our work. It's exciting to see today's abolitionists who are going so much further in challenging the prevailing ideology. I like to think that we planted some of the seeds. The third thing I wanted to talk about, and the last thing, is just it's important to stay mobilized at the grassroots and in the streets. We took hundreds of people in bus and car caravans, sometimes to 3 prisons in a day. We might go to Dwight Women's Prison, Menard, where death sentences were carried out, and Marian. Along with many others, we successfully shut down the Lexington Control Unit for Women, and we were at prisons in Indiana. We marched for many years up and down Michigan Avenue during the height of Christmas shopping, and we rallied at the MCC. We were in the streets of many other towns near the prisons and as close as they would let us get to the gates of those prisons. We confronted the head of the BOP when he spoke at the American Correctional Association conference in Chicago. With my heart pounding, I insisted that he answer our questions about Marian. I thought I was being quite polite, yet he refused and fled the room and the conference along with his bodyguards. I talked with 2 Congress people back when we were doing the work, Representative Kastenmeier of Wisconsin and Pat Schroeder of Colorado. They both confirmed how hard it was to stand up for any criminal justice reform, even nighttime basketball, she said. It would mean defeat in the next election. Kastenmeier was a good ally of ours and helped us get the toxic water changed at Marian. And he did lose his last election. So even with fresh new faces in Congress like the Squad, don't take your foot off the pedal just because Democrats are in power. After all, they helped create the problem. The movement is the engine. Grassroots organizing and phenomenon like Occupy and Black Lives Matter make all the difference in the world. And I pass to Toussaint.
Appreciate that. Yeah, just a couple points that Nancy highlighted that I think it's worth picking up on, particularly this idea of the how much the buildup of mass incarceration came in response to the insurgency of the 60s and 70s, and really the importance of understanding the changing landscape of the criminal justice system, that really the changes that have taken place over the past 50 years, really being a reflection of, in particular, that dynamic of counterinsurgency. I'm sure we'll have a little bit more time to talk about it later, but the workaround control unit really helped reveal that and demonstrate that. And one of the things that I've at least been concerned about and really taken time to sort of dig into in my own research is the way that that's not only impacted the federal prison system, but also the state prison system as well, too. And just as Nancy was saying, what's really been fundamental for me to being able to do that was following the insights and experiences of folks behind bars and also people who have been active on the streets. So one of those folks who wasn't able to join us today, but hopefully you all get a chance to hear from later is Bradley Greene, who was a member of the Black Panther Party chapter in Chicago. And he was born and raised in Chicago, and out of his work in the party ended up being incarcerated in part out of the shooting of a police officer in retaliation for the assassination of Fred Hampton, and spent a good part of the early 70s in Stateville Penitentiary. And, Stateville is, along with Pontiac, Joliet, and Menard, was one of the maximum security facilities in Illinois. And I think one of the things that people today don't appreciate is how much those prisons in particular were just hotbeds of political activity during the course of the 1970s, really through the course of the decade. And it wasn't just the fact that you had political people like Bradley in those facilities, but you had folks who had been exposed to the civil rights movement, who had been exposed to the Black Power movement, who hadn't been involved in political organizations, who might have even been involved in gang organizations, but because of the ways in which those movements impacted their lives individually, and the way in which those movements also impacted the way in which folks who were organized, whether they were, say, for instance, in street gang organizations, understood themselves and really were kind of pushed and agitated towards rethinking their place in society and the way in which they could change it, found themselves in one way or another involved in some sort of political activity. In many ways, if you look at the history of Chicago, so many of the street organizations changed the way in which they moved on the street, changed the way in which they even understood themselves and called themselves, the names that they used, kind of out of a reflection of the impact of the movements of the day on their own kind of self-identity. That continued behind bars, and Bradley's own experience speaks to the way in which those efforts to kind of further politicize and engage folks in political activity continued. It didn't stop, such that we today might know of the Attica Prison Rebellion, but we probably don't know of the various different, as Nancy was saying, kind of forms of protest, work stoppages, hunger strikes, protests that took place in the Illinois prison system during the course of the 70s. And in many ways, that was kind of exemplified by two different rebellions that happened in the summer of 1978 in both Pontiac and Stateville prison. And we'll probably get a little bit more time to talk about some of the details, but when I've been privileged enough to talk to not just Bradley, but other guys who were in the Black Panther Party or who were politically active at that period of time, one of the basic things that they were doing was trying to get guys who weren't political to understand this, not only the severity of the situation that they were in, but just to think about the ways in which, rather than venting their frustrations on each other, right? And rather than continuing some of the rivalries and conflicts that had marked their experience on the street, to kind of shift their perspective and challenge the administration and challenge the the folks who were directly responsible for the conditions that they were in. And so much of the political agitation was about saying, let's come together and instead of fighting each other, let's fight the administration. And that result, the outcome of that was a rebellion that took place in Stateville Penitentiary in 1978 that led to a lockdown at that facility, and then at roughly the same time, a rebellion at Pontiac that led to a lockdown of that facility, led to the death of 3 prison guards. The 3 other prison guards were injured. But during the course of the rebellion, prisoners targeted the laundry because it had done such a terrible job of actually cleaning the uniforms, targeted the commissary because of the high prices that prisoners were being charged for the goods that they were looking to purchase there, and severely damaged many parts of the prison itself, which had been in operation since about 1871, right? So was over 100 years old by that point. And we'll get a chance to talk about kind of what some of the dynamics of repression kind of resulted from that. But one of the things that I just want to impress is that although that is not a kind of a Illinois version of Attica that most of us are familiar with, that it's one that definitely made an impact on prison officials in the state and would have a long-term impact on the ways in which the Illinois prison system would develop years later. And it's important, I think, for us to kind of keep in mind the dynamics of how, even if we forget some of this history or don't do a good job of passing it along, many of the different parts of the system, institutions that are looking to figure out how to better control people might not forget as easily.
Thank you so much. No, that's just brilliant, and I'm just really staying on that point exactly as you said, Toussaint, and then also Nancy. I mean, I love how you framed it as mass incarceration could be seen is a form of counterinsurgency, and so just on that, and one of the takeaways that's just so loud and clear from Pontiac, Marian prisons is how prisons do serve as tools of repression, political repression, and that it seems like it's something that we don't talk as much about today, or at least we don't draw those clear connections that you're pushing us to draw between, we use the term prison boom, prison industrial complex, but the connection between what these formations and, so the government's sort of longstanding use of incarceration in response to political resistance and organizing, particularly sort of Black-led movement work. So I wanted just to open up the floor for you to say more about that. And really sort of help us to draw those connections and about how repression has worked and has sort of transmuted over time, and also how those sort of past actions have been led to against that. That can really inform sort of our work today, because currently it's a whole other dimension level of a lockdown that we're under, and so even though we are thinking about people are thinking about the way that society may quote unquote open up post-COVID, what does this mean then when we think about the prison industrial complex and the ways that they've been allowed to operate for the past year?
Me?
Oh, whomever, yeah, both of you, please.
I hope this is responsive to your question. I'm not exactly sure, but it also will give a little more history about the resistance that happened at Marian with repression as well. So it took enormous courage on the part of prisoners at Marian to resist the brutal conditions. And yet, long before we arrived on the scene, which was 1985, they did resist. For instance, in 1972, Puerto Rican political prisoner Rafael Cancel Miranda and others launched a peaceful work strike. I think Toussaint might have been referring to it, a work stoppage. And then came the repression. Suspected leaders were punished, and one section, one unit of the prison was established where prisoners were kept in isolation 23 hours a day. And that was like a prison within a prison, and it was the first control unit in the country. In addition, the visitors were harassed with people sniffing dogs and demands for photographs, fingerprints, and strip searches. And they either could undergo those things or they would have to forfeit their visits. And then by the time we arrived in 1985 on the scene, not in the prison, the whole prison was on permanent lockdown. All 350 men were being held in indefinite long-term solitary confinement. And it was collective punishment for the actions of two Aryan Brotherhood men who had killed a guard in that first control unit, the unit that was ostensibly meant to eliminate prisoner violence. Sundiata Acoli describes how for 6 months, wolf packs of prison guards roamed the prison and set upon prisoners and beat, brutalized, and abused them. And an ex-warden, Ralph Ahrens, testified in 1975, and I'm quoting here, "The purpose of Marian was to control revolutionary attitudes in the prison system and the society at large," end quote. So people were sent to Marian because they hadn't supposedly adjusted to the oppressive conditions in other prisons. They were work strike organizers, they were leaders of religious services, they were jailhouse lawyers who were thought to file too many writs and too many grievances, and they were political prisoners. It's an understatement to say that prisoner resistance is a very risky business, given the control the administration has over every aspect of a prisoner's life. Clearly, with all prisoners in solitary for 23 hours a day, resistance had to take different forms. So, but as we were organizing outside, we were fully assisted by many prisoners on the inside. They organized each other, don't ask me how, because they were all in solitary. They gave direction to our work. They wrote brief reflections on the conditions and lengthy descriptions about the nature of the prison. They found ways to communicate with us when it was blocked by the administration, and they organized their family members to support our work. They did all this despite the understanding that there could and would be retaliation against them. And even when there was retaliation, they cheered us on and supported our work. They were the ones who kept us going. And many of the members of their family members joined in our work. Torn by the desire to protect their sons or their brothers or their husbands or their nephews or their uncles, many of them chose to speak out, to march, to confront the prison and the prison bureaucrats. So resistance happens in so many different ways, sometimes dramatic. 1995 rebellion and resistance racked the federal prison system. As prison after prison, people reacted to the refusal of Congress to accept the recommendations of the US Sentencing Commission to make more equitable the sentencing for powder versus crack cocaine. This congressional decision had no justification but white privilege. And as the prisoners rebelled, the entire federal system, all 80 prisons and all 100,000 prisoners were put on lockdown.
Lady, stop reading.
Stop. Did you say?
No. So please keep going, Nancy. I think it was just a mistake from someone else's part.
But I also want to say that that resistance often comes more quietly. It happens when prisoners with political convictions hang on to them. And when those who not consciously political before prison take to reading and developing their understandings of the world around them. It happens when people find ways to survive and hold on to their sanity and humanity, despite the horrendous conditions, sometimes through creative art, poetry, and writing. And when prisoners support one another in individual and collective ways around health and other issues. And it happens when older, more experienced folks mentor young people. Such a resistance leader was James Yaqui Sales, AKA Atiba Shana. You can learn more about him from his website. Just Google James Yaqui Sales, Sayles. He initiated study groups inside and published internal newsletters. Although not a defendant, he was one of the leaders of the Pontiac prison defense effort from inside his prison cell. Yaqui was a brilliant thinker. After decades of incarceration and a persistent campaign to get him out on parole, he came to live in our home in 2004. Unfortunately, he lived only a few years in freedom when health issues struck him down. And at his memorial, one after another Black man got up, often in tears, and thanked Yaqui for helping him turn his life around. Yaqui was resistance incarnate. So there's a long and deep history of resistance on the inside, and we need to do our part on the outside. Thank you. And
Thank you so much, Nancy. Jason?
Sure. And I'm just sharing another link in the chat, but wanted to share information about James Yaqui Sales, who Nancy just mentioned, who was another originally from Chicago, who was incredibly important prison organizer, prison intellectual, was a comrade of Bradley Greene's, who I mentioned earlier, and was involved in a lot of the organizing that led up to the Pontiac and Stateville rebellions that took place in 1978, and was also played a lead role as a strategist and as a jailhouse lawyer, prison lawyer, in support of the campaign of the Pontiac brothers. And kind of just on this question of repression, Nancy mentioned it a little bit, but it's just worth noting that in retaliation for the rebellion that took place in Pontiac, what state authorities did was allege that was the result of a gang conspiracy, and ultimately indicted 17 prisoners, many of them high-ranking members of different Chicago street gangs, and say that they were responsible for really the what prison officials had already acknowledged was this kind of explosion of pent-up frustration about the conditions in the facility. And this wasn't just an indictment that was like an attempt to severely punish those who were believed to be involved, but each of those 17 defendants was charged with capital murder for the death of the deaths of the 3 prison guards that took place during the rebellion, and it was essentially a mass capital punishment case. And for those who would later be involved in efforts to kind of end capital punishment, the death penalty in Illinois, it's sort of one of the first efforts to really kind of fight back against what had been a newly reinstated effort at executing folks for those found guilty. And one of the things that I just wanted to highlight was on this question of repression. We'll have a little bit of time later on to talk about organizing that's happening today, right? Against, in an effort to bring back parole in Illinois. And so one of the things that I learned about when I was searching through those boxes that Nancy mentioned being in her basement, was really the not only innovative organizing that folks were doing in the defense campaign to save the Pontiac brothers from the electric chair, but the way that they were making really important connections about the dynamics of this repression, right? So one of the things that they noted was not only was the Pontiac rebellion, acknowledged by state officials themselves, this response to the terrible conditions in Pontiac and in Stateville, but that it was also a response to a newly passed sentencing bill in Illinois. And that sentencing bill was kind of, the shorthand for it was the Class X sentencing bill. And what that bill essentially did was eliminate parole as an option for many serious felony crimes. And what I learned from further digging was that although that bill had been signed into law by Governor Thompson, Big Jim Thompson, when he came into office, the initial framework for it had been developed during the previous administration, and it had specifically been crafted really out of the expressed intention of passing a criminal sentencing law that might help to tamp down some of the organizing and the activism happening behind bars, with the understanding that part of the motivation for this organizing was not the terrible conditions or just the broader forms of racial oppression that prisons help to typify, or the particularly brutal forms of our class society that had occasioned folks to end up in prison in the first place. But the fact that prisoners were just frustrated because they felt like the parole system wasn't fair, and that they had indeterminate sentences that might have them in prison from 2 to 10 years. They would go up before the parole board, and the parole board would deny them. And so the presumption was, if you eliminated parole, if you effectively abolished parole, that might help to tamp down on some of this activism. And what that, not only was that a weird sort of logic train to follow in the first place, but it ultimately ended up, one of the things that it ultimately ended up doing was empowering guards in really decrepit facilities like Stateville and Pontiac with another tool of control, which was basically to deny prisoners good time for any infraction of prison rules. And it was in part in digging through these boxes that Nancy and Steve had in their basement that I learned that one of the central complaints that prisoners had was that that guards were increasingly passing out these disciplinary tickets during the summer of 1978. And that's one of the things that helped spur the mounting frustrations that led to the rebellions. And that law the Class X law is also important because it's one of a number of other sort of highly punitive laws that have been passed in Illinois from the late 70s through the early 90s, which effectively helped to build up the Illinois prison system. In fact, and we don't talk about this that much these days, and it's striking, especially in this moment, that we don't talk about it, but the conditions, not only were the conditions so bad in these facilities, but these laws like Class X were actually sending more people to prison for longer periods of time, such that the system was severely overcrowded by the time that we get to the early 1980s. And in response to that, prison officials were actively cutting corners as much as they could to release prisoners as a way of undermining this overcrowding. Something similar sort of happened relatively recently with Governor Quinn on a smaller scale. But in 1981, 1982, prison officials were making every effort to prevent their facilities from becoming overcrowded out of a concern that if they allowed if they allowed this overcrowding to persist, they would see another Pontiac rebellion. And out of the public pressure of folks like then State's Attorney General Richard M. Daley, they were actually forced to kind of stop doing that and instead focus solely on prison building as a way to get out of that problem. And as a result, Illinois built not dozens, but Illinois built a number of prisons between 1981 and 1991, such that by the time we get to 1991, Illinois has the fastest growing prison system in the country. And it's building, it's opening about a prison or two every year. And part of the reason, one of the things that's striking about that is that it's doing this consistently out of a concern that if it does not continue to try to build its way out of the problem of more people going to prison for longer periods of time without the option of getting out early from some sort of parole decision, they will end up with another Pontiac Rebellion. And it is one of the things that really has left a profound mark on the Illinois prison system today, that that is noticeable by the fact that most of those facilities are not maximum security facilities like Pontiac, Stateville, Menard, and Joliet used to be, but are medium security facilities, or in some instances also minimum security facilities. Much of that as a kind of reflection of the dynamic of the war on drugs, but also a reflection of the way in which much of the emphasis on sort of building its way out of this problem wasn't simply a question of trying to mitigate against having more and more violent prisoners or prisoners who are going to create more problems, but actually try to really build its way out of the social problems and the economic problems occasioned by the economic transformations that took place during the course of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that have, marked Chicago with deindustrialization, closed factories, fewer job opportunities, things of that nature. So it's a mix of kind of big scale shifts that have taken place and efforts to kind of develop kind of new and more sophisticated forms of kind of social control more broadly, but kind of reflecting some of what Nancy talked about. Illinois ended up following the example of the Marian Control Unit by building its own super maximum security facility in Tams, Illinois, during the course of the 1990s. And, as a result of some of the organizing that people on this call have been involved in, that facility has been closed down. But part of the, really that problem of trying to address the way in which prisons reflect not only this broader effort to push forward really crude forms of social control, but also kind of drawing on the experience of folks like Bradley Greene as a kind of technique of political repression as well, that we've seen some of the ways in which forms of long-term solitary confinement have continued even after Tams was shut down, and is really an important thing for people to keep in mind as they figure out how to organize and push forward in this day and age.
Thank you so much for that history, Tucson. I mean, I just listening, it makes, I'm sure, many of us think about the ways that the architecture of the legal system is used as a tool to, has been continually used as a tool to lock up activists, to legitimate locking up activists, and then to keep people confined, which provides a whole new further context, that sense of urgency around the need for parole, or an avenue for parole. And so I really wanted to bring in the voice of a brilliant activist, Meli Rios, who works with Parole Illinois and is the partner of Meli Rios, who is incarcerated in Stateville Prison. Meli, you're there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes, it's so wonderful to see you.
Hi, how are you? Basically, Benny's serving a 45-year sentence. He's sentenced under the Truth in Sentencing Act. So there's no possibility of him to come home anytime soon. And, he's still doing everything he has to do in there. PI has a SB, the bill out right now for to bring back parole to Illinois, and I think everybody's aware of it. It's SB 233 and then HB 2399. You know, visits just went back into session. I was finally able to see him on Monday, the first. I had to be there the first day when it opened up, right? And it's wonderful to be in the same room with him, but you know, they've been on lockdown, and everything that Toussaint was saying earlier about what happened before, right, is basically going on now. They're still on lockdown for, you know, usually when they're on lockdown is because they did something wrong and they're confined to their cells when they go to SAG. And when they're in SAG, which is solitary confinement, you visit them through a glass. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. We're visiting them through a glass, through a plexiglass. You know, we can't hug each other. We can't, you know, we can't be a family, right? They take that away from every correctional center. They have no family values there whatsoever. So, you know, you try to make the best of it, but they're getting punished for something that they have no control over. And then they're on top of a lockdown, on top of a lockdown. There's times where I don't hear from him like 3 or 4 days because they're on lockdown for God knows what. So, you know, there's so many people out there that are the voices of our loved ones that, you know, that they're just trying to make, you know, make sense of everything that's going on. You know, it's not only us out here going through it, it's also, you know, they're affected by it so much. And it's so hard because it's frustrating, you know, and so like we have an Illinois Prison Lockdown Coalition that, you know, we're fighting for visits and, you know, and now we have them and they're determined to stay on top of it to where, you know, if in 60 days, if nothing changes, because they said they're going to monitor for 60 days, 60 days, nothing changes, then they're going to, you know, they're going to fight harder to get what we need to get. You know, PI is coming out with these new bills, you know, to bring back parole. Parole needs to be brought back, you know. It's just so crazy how, you know, I get it. And, you know, my husband is there for a crime he did commit, but there's so many men and women that are in there for crimes they did not commit. You know, they did not commit. And my husband has rehabilitated himself. You know, he can come out here and make such a change with, you know, like him and I are still talking about Adam, you know, Adam Toledo that was murdered. And it's like, you know, you have Pablo that's out there, you know, Oscar and people that were just released after serving 20 years and they're making a difference in their neighborhoods and other neighborhoods. And, you know, we need to bring these men and women home. We need to bring these men and women home. And, you know, we have all these wonderful groups that are our loved ones' voices. And, you know, we're, you know, with PI, we're meeting with senators, you know, House reps. I've been on so many meetings with them, just, you know, trying to get them to support the bill. And we've been pretty successful, you know, thankfully we've been pretty successful with things. And, you know, and then people like you all that just, you know, just support them. And that's such a blessing to us as family that we know that there's still great people out there that, you know, that want to make a change, that want to be part of the change. And there's also a lot of men and women in there that don't have loved ones, that we're their voices, right? We are their voices. We are the ones who can speak on their behalf. And I can sit here all day and tell you what a great man my husband is because I'm in love with him, right? But there's plenty of you on here that know him personally, that know who he is. And then there's so many others like him, you know, behind those walls. And with y'all doing this and, you know, out there, you know, just voicing your, you know, just being their voices, you know, just with the visiting starting, I actually made directions on how to do it online because we have a lot of people, their parents are older and they don't know, they're not computer savvy. So I made directions and I've been sending it to them. And if they can't do it, then, you know, I help them walk it through it. But we have to stick together. We're a family. We're a family, not by blood, but by what we're fighting for. And I appreciate you all for doing this. And I thank you all for letting me be here today and just hearing, you know, a bit of our story. I mean, you know, I sat in Professor Kim's class about 2 weeks ago, and I was given 45 minutes, and I talked for more time than I was supposed to. And Pablo, I told Pablo, see, this is why they give me a time limit when I'm on with the senators and that, because, you know, I could go on just because it means so much. It means so much to our family, to, you know, to my daughters. They're older already. We have grandchildren. And if nothing happens, he won't be home until he's 70 years old, if he's still alive by then. So continue in the fight to bring them home. I appreciate you all. And my husband appreciates you all. I told him I was speaking today, and he just thanks you. And I'm sure many other men and women, they all thank you. And, you know, let's just keep fighting until we get what we need, and they get what they do, you know, what they need as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meli. Toussaint, Nancy, I really would love to, you know, open the floor for you to respond and offer comments.
I don't really have a response. I just so appreciate Meli's words, and it brings, every time I hear someone talk about their loved ones in prison, it makes me want to cry. So I really don't have any words at the moment. I just want to thank you.
Yeah, most certainly, Meli. I mean, Benny has touched the lives of so many people, even as he is inside, and that's, you know, saying so much. So I also wanted to bring in Mr. Kilroy Watkins, who is on the survivor board of the Chicago Torture Justice Center, and also on the Reentry board of the Education Justice Project. And Kilroy, I mean, you have so much knowledge, and so I'd love for you to offer comments or questions that based on our conversation thus far.
Well, first I'd like to say, hey, Meli, good to see you again, going strong, and definitely our hearts goes out with you, and can't wait and for the meet up with you again, and for we can continue talking about strategies and moving forward to release long-term prisoners and bring some parole board, or discretionary board back. And also, I'd like to commend the work of many formerly incarcerated people who's even on this call right now, who stepped out the door like I did and hit the ground running. I served nearly 30 years after being tortured by John Burge and many Chicago police detectives. But during that 30-year experience, I utilized my time by either going back to school, in particular, obtaining my paralegal certificate and working in the law library. And anyone know that anyone who didn't work in the law library, you become a frontline advocate for all prisoners against all of the injustice that they endure and suffer, not just in court, but also against racist and brutal attacks by prison guards. And I was just having a flashback a minute ago when Toussaint, the brother, was speaking about these false narratives they use to build prisons. And he was speaking about Pontiac. And I served my first 10-year sentence in Pontiac in the 90s, in which he was speaking about the open TAMs. I recall all of those things. But what was interesting, what happened to Pontiac today, even though it's cemented in everyone's history about Pontiac 1978, and the narrative of the danger of prison rebellion and the need for more guards and the need for more money, this illusion continued to exist to the point where it's that even while I was there in, I was housed in Pontiac Correction Center in 1995, I believe, one of the racist guards assassinated from the gun tower, something that they regularly did, took shots at prisoners on the yard or in the cell house under the false illusion of he thought he seen a weapon. Much of what we hear echoed with a lot of the cops in America today about the shooting of unarmed civilians. I thought the cell phone or the submarine or the Gatorade was a weapon. But prison guards usually often don't use items. They just said that, well, he may have made a gesture and movement, but in 95, they killed one of the prisoners. And we went on one of the lockdowns that Nancy spoke about and to St. talked about this 23-1. And out of a union protest by guards, when it came near the time after us litigating through the court that the lockdown was becoming extremely excessive and long, and they wasn't justified in denying us access to showers and telephone and visitors, and and the courts were siding with us, then the union took a proactive move and said, well, told the administration of Springfield, if you release those guys and return them back to population, we would not return back to work. At that point, that was the last day in which Pontiac Maximum Correctional Facility became a population facility. It turned into, in Illinois, the first maximum segregated housing unit permanently. It would not let us off. In fact, they decided to say we would rather transfer the population out to other facilities before we release them in population again. And we only doing this for the safety of the guards who fear for their life if you release these dangerous prisoners back out into population. And what they failed to share in their narrative was the fact that the
Kilroy, we can't quite hear you.
Kilroy, I think that you went out for just a moment there. Yes.
Okay, I'm back, Dave.
Yes. Well,
Sorry
yeah,
about
you said
that.
well, we had failed to. Yeah.
So what did I stop there, Dave?
You said well, we had failed to.
Oh, what the prison guard failed, what the administration failed to acknowledge was the fact that the treatment of prisoners was very brutal prior to the permanent lockdown. And the guards didn't have no concern about that whatsoever, right? Even though we experienced, Pontiac experienced the 1978 riots and eventually reopen, restaff, and continue, they seem to use this unjustifiable killing as inherent fear that it can no longer release the prisons back into population. They can no longer allow contact visits. They no longer can allow just open access to yard and healthcare. And eventually they called it a segregation facility. And what they did to many, they changed the IDRs, what we call the institutional department rules or directives. And what they put into those IDRs was, now while the prisoner was in the cell, for him pushing back about the brutal conditions, stuck in the cell during a hot summertime, no access to adequate food, water, medical facility, they began to stream out for some attention, for some rights. And what they do is change the rules and say, well, if you complain, we're gonna call that a violation of rules, right? And we're gonna strip you of your privilege. So you say, well, wait a minute, what privilege? You currently got me on a 24-hour lockdown. So what they'll do is say, well, we're gonna move you to another unit and we're gonna place you under indeterminate seg, which means that you are being placed in a hold, but you no longer have an out date, right? And we also now can restrict your access to how much mail you can get, how much contact you come into with other people. We're gonna just tighten up on all what we call the sensory, human senses, to deprive you. Now, keep in mind what made Pontiac so unique in its ability to punish individuals was the fact that it took numerous federal lawsuits from the Seventh Circuit to force Pontiac to stop placing prisoners behind what we call the door. The door was located on the first floor in the North House, which was the extension of Death Row that sat on the back end of the North House. The door was the ultimate punishment because behind the door was absolutely nothing. Not a window, no sunlight, no toilet. It was just a hole in the wall and in the floor, right? And they will shove the food in there. If you got the privilege to get a tray, if the guards chose to feed you, they'll just shove it through the bottom of the chuck hole and slam it back. And originally they said they supposed to keep a person there for a week to break them, but they got so punitive at times that they kept them there indefinitely, months. And you begin to hear these guys stream out under the door in agony and pain as their mind was breaking. And many of the litigators and law clerks and those who's aware of it, we started litigating about it and bringing it to the court's attention and bringing it to
All right.
take pictures
Hello?
of this. Yes, you with me?
Yes, yes.
Take pictures of the door to return back to the court can see these conditions, these deplorable conditions. And so Pontiac definitely was a very, very brutal place. And I spent a great deal of time at Stateville and Bernard as well. And they don't add up to anything under the definition of human rights. I continue to litigate all the way up until my release date. And I must give a lot of honor to a former Black Panther, Black Liberation Army natural lifer who was named Bantu, but he was also known as a writ writer. But he fought for everyone. I believe he's in Stateville. He's a senior and he's very sick right now. But he was my mentor. And what I didn't recognize about the law, he shared with me and showed me how you can immediately file emergency writs to bring to the courts the conditions of prison conditions. And so what they're doing now to update everyone is changing the rules, as Nancy and Toussaint spoke about earlier, to crack down and make it very difficult for one to reach out to bring these deplorable conditions to the public attention, right? And so one must do by any means necessary. Even when I was retaliated as a law clerk for helping individuals out, I had to go to segregation. But because of the work that I was doing, they often have workers or some other guards who often come around and be amazed that you would be placed in segregation for simply doing a grievance or simply complaining. And so they would find ways to get us paper or a pencil so we can communicate. And then we got to get that information in the hands of another prisoner who may have the write out, which is the envelope, and he will have to send it out for you. So we had to find ways to network collectively together. And it was not a matter of leisure activity. There was a survival tool because failing to organize and failing to do things to bring to the public light likely meant more torture and a lot more death to many prisoners. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you so much, Kilroy. We are at time, over time, and so there's so much more that we could talk about. I mean, one thing I wanted to ask both Nancy and Toussaint, with both of you about is, both of you, I think, model really in really powerful ways how we should be thinking about how we should preserve and document our organizing work. So I think, Nancy, your decision to give your papers to the Freedom Archives, I think is a really powerful example, and so something I think that we all could be thinking about right now, even as we deal with unprecedented levels of surveillance, is this question of how do we actually document and preserve our work. But I wanted to offer, let people know about upcoming events next week. The Prison and Neighborhood Arts Education Project, PNAP, will be hosting an event entitled Imagining and Remaking a World Without Prisons, Visions study and practice on Monday, April 26th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. We are also the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture will be hosting an event alongside with the lab entitled Felon, a play and a discourse, and that's going to be a conversation between Eve Ewing and Reginald Dwayne Betts on Thursday. And so many things happening next week. And so please do have that on your calendars. But just as a closing, I wanted to, bring up that, so often, we're in a position, especially now, of having to, struggle with how to move forward. We know that we must organize, but this question of why do we organize, especially when we face so much state repression. And Angela Davis gave a talk a couple of years ago in Greece entitled Abolition and Feminism, but she said, when we call for a better world, I'm quoting, when we call for a better world, when we protest, our vision finds its focus generations in the future. We struggle now, not only for the world we collectively want and need, but also in order to enable generations to continue our work. And so the work that you've done, Nancy, and the work that you've been documenting, Toussaint, is just so imperative. And we thank you so much for joining us today. And I thank each of you on this call for joining us as well. Stay well and stay safe, everyone.